This is Game 3 of Team Yandex vs LGD Gaming in the grand finals of the $1 million Blast Slam 7 tournament. By the way, this video is rated XXX hardcore spoilers for this game, so if you're saving your Blast Slam virginity, now would be a good time to pause this video. This isn't some random clip. This is the play that led me down a path of slowly unraveling everything I thought I knew about Valve's Pro Dota prediction model. This 2 minutes of nothing happening is what Valve's prediction blames for Yandex losing the game. With the International coming up fast, now seems like the right time to show how Valve's Pro Dota predictions are a lot weirder, a bit worse, and worse for a lot of weirder reasons than I think anybody realized, myself included. Valve's Pro Dota predictions break away from their Pub Dota predictions in ways that force systematically less confident forecasts. Or, in layman's terms, Valve's Pro Dota predictions prefer a 50-50 tie, or as close as it can manage, even when one team is clearly ahead, and this is just an appetizer. The process of proving this was an arduous journey of frantic checking and double-checking. So much of what you're about to see feels so wrong that I needed an abundance of proof just to believe it myself. And it was all triggered by this specific play, and that's because this is the 2-minute stretch that Valve's prediction model believes cost Team Yandex this game. Dota is a 5v5 real-time strategy game where players get gold for achieving feats in the game, such as temporarily killing enemy players or permanently destroying enemy buildings. I'm a regular guy who has spent thousands of hours progressively getting worse at Dota. People like me play in the normal lobby with other normal schlubs. These are called public matchmaking games, or pubs. But then, on the other side, there's an entire professional tier of Dota that are played by the world's elite players for millions of dollars. In my most recent video, I discovered and showed that it only takes 3 numbers to predict pub games better than Valve does. But I never bothered to train a model on pro games. My model, which was built exclusively from regular matchmaking games, was already beating Valve when it came to predicting pro games. So I was ready to call that a win and move on to other topics until somebody sent me this clip. This is Quinn. He's a former pro player and multi-time the international runner-up. He is definitely one of the very best players to ever touch the game.
Yeah, I will also say the Dota Plus win percent counter, while that thing is not always correct, it always means something. And the fact that even while LGD is down like 7k gold, it says like maybe 40% chance of them. Those are ridiculous numbers. And I think it says something about the individual matchups, like you said, right? The comfort on LGD. It's not just the comfort. They have really good core-to-core matchups. Naga Siren is great against SF, and Darkseer is also amazing against SF. Look at these numbers. This is not normally. Normally, it'll be like, I don't know, 80, 90% for one team with a lead this much this early in the game. That says something about your hero matchups. Not talking about the other 2 lanes got raffle stomped. And that's a problem, especially if in next game Yandex has a draft that scales better, right? Imagine if they can just sit on their haunches and it's fine, and the graph says something very, very different. Then this is a sure loss. You can't have lanes like this.
The process of outpredicting Valve required me to measure Valve's efficacy both in pro games and in pub games. And what I found is that Valve is very close to perfect when predicting pub games. So at first I was inclined to agree with Quinn that the model must be seeing something to seed these very strange predictions. But over my research, I've come to find that that's probably not true. To be crystal clear, I am not disagreeing with Quinn's assessment of the game here, but I am curious if the vulnerabilities that Quinn has identified are the actual reason Valve's prediction behaved in the seemingly unintuitive way that it did. Despite all metrics pointing toward an outstanding Radiant lead in the first 12 minutes of this game, Valve's model is being pretty skeptical that they'll actually win. First, let's not take anything for granted. Let's just see how unusual this prediction is by checking what Valve's typical prediction would be in pro games with similar situations. Out of the several hundred pro games that are on my hard drive right now, I found about a dozen with similar game states to Blast Finals Game 3. Here's the absolute net worth lead and Valve's prediction for each game at 12 minutes. Red-coded games are Dire, blue-coded games are Radiant, and the yellow game is the one that we're looking at. Usually, Valve is predicting this lead very confidently, around 85% in favor of the leading team. Let's check the trajectory of the games. Let's make each game a chain with the state from 1 and 2 minutes later. This sample is too small to say anything for sure, but it does look a bit like Dyer might be getting more favorable predictions here. Look, for example, at this game. Both of our games start with about the same lead. The white line here is the amount of lead lost over the next couple minutes, and the blue line is the amount of win probability lost over that same time period. At least from this sample, it looks like Dyer and Radiant may be graded on different scales, but we'll have to come back to that. For now, let's just get rid of Dyer games, clear up the visual clutter, and make sure we have some fair comparisons. But even then, this game is pretty abnormal. I also just want to adjust and look at the lead in relative terms. Instead of absolute net worth lead, this looks at the percentage of the winning team's net worth that is lead. Here we see a much more noticeable drop in our game, which does explain some of the probability loss, but it's still really severe compared to peer games like this one, where much more of the overall net worth lead was lost. But the end prediction is still better than the starting prediction for our game. In fact, there are no other games in the last several months where a team has had 6,700 or more net worth by 12 minutes with under 70% chance to win by Valve's estimates. So far, we have two theories here. So theory 1, Dyer's draft is just better, and that is why Radiant is being discounted. From the very beginning of this game, Valve seems to favor Dyer's draft. A 60% advantage to Dyer before the teams have even seen each other seems very extreme, especially considering these heroes are not exactly imbalanced against each other. There's a lot of ways to measure hero advantage and hero interactions, and maybe Valve's model is a lot smarter than I give it credit for, but the immediately available data does not seem to imply that the model is doing this for a reason that's based on draft. Shadow Fiend actually does better than average against Naga Siren, winning over 53% of games in the past 3 patches. But either way, I did a check across 495 pro games and found that Valve's pre-game predictions are wrong 52.3% of the time. Valve's predictions only really become usable after 5 minutes into the typical pro game, sometimes longer. So whatever priors they're taking in from the draft are actually making its model worse. Suddenly, we have no good reason to believe the model is making a 300 IQ recognition of draft factors. Now, it looks like maybe it can't even tie its own shoes. This model would be more accurate if it didn't even have draft data and it just predicted Radiant at the beginning of every game. That's really weird, because in pub games, Valve's model is much better at predicting based on the draft. They clearly know how to make a model that can incorporate this data. Even our sort of small sample size on pro games doesn't cover up for this. The error margins cannot account for all of these differences. So the next obvious step here would be checking whether Valve is consistent with how it handles this specific hero dynamic in its predictions. That would give us a small test if the model does actually understand the big brain factors that Quinn and the panel are talking about. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as just going out and finding this exact draft and this exact situation in another game, and then seeing if Valve predicted it the same way. This exact matchup has never happened before in Pro Dota. In fact, this is the only game in Pro Dota history where a Shadow Fiend and a Death Prophet faced off against a Naga Siren. Just those 3 heroes in this arrangement makes it an incredibly unique game. There's not a single usable game that even matches 60% of the same team compositions in the last 6 months of pubs, which are millions of games. But the panel, and Quinn in particular, highlighted a relationship between 3 specific heroes: Shadow Fiend, Naga Siren, and Darkseer. And I did find this specific arrangement in a pub match. So this match has all the same core-on-core matchups that Quinn identified, plus a little extra late-game danger from the Spectre. And it's a pub match which we know handles draft even more accurately than however the pro games are handling it. If the mid-game skepticism is really based around the late-game strength of Naga's team, we should see it replicated here. But at 12 minutes, 30% less of a lead, Valve's model is predicting a higher win rate for the Shadow Fiend's team. The variance here could be due to a lot of factors. Maybe Pudge and Silencer are seen as enough scaling to remove doubts about the late game, or maybe Valve's model is looking at the pace of kills and not just the rate of net worth gain, or 100 other reasons. These are overall different games, they just have some similarities. But this did convince me to look deeper into this problem. At least we know that the model's skepticism isn't just a case of hero matchups. Something else is happening here. Before we move on, here's a quick interruption. If you haven't done a random act of kindness for somebody today, you could put a giant smile on my face by hitting the like button. And if you're enjoying the video, go ahead and subscribe. It's a little something for you, it's a big something for me. Everybody wins. If you felt this video had a je ne sais quoi, leave me a comment. I will definitely read it. I may even respond, and it might be featured in a future video. Thanks for the like, the subscribe, the comment if you leave one, and let's get back to the video. That leaves theory 2. That Dire's draft is better for the late game, Radiant's draft is being discounted for stalling out. Maybe it's even a combination of the draft strength and the game state, where Valve really just excels at discriminating. To test this, we can look at the 1,238 pro matches since the last major game update. That's patch 7.4.1, when facets were removed from the game. For those games, let's count up the win rate for every hero in long games between 40 and 50 minutes, and ultra long games, 50 or more minutes. It's immediately clear that Radiant has drafted 2 of the 3 worst heroes for the very late game, and 2 more that are in the bottom half of heroes. LGD, on the other hand, have 2 of the top 12 heroes. So yes, it's very clear that Dire have the better late game. We can even average the teams together for a direct comparison. Now, if we were trying to predict Dota games with this, we would be much more nuanced with the way that we put it together. But here we just need a smell test to see if this kind of data is influencing the way that Valve is making predictions. This gives us a simple and empirical check to see which team's heroes, on average, are probably better suited for long games. Yes, Radiant is on the clock. They have a worse late game draft. So we know that this time pressure exists in the data, and it is possible that Valve's model could be identifying it. But if that were the case, we would expect it to behave a bit differently. Hey, so this is a message from future me during editing. I had a whole section here about all the weird little nuances of this game's win probabilities that tipped me off about Valve's model, probably predominantly using something other than late game hero performance for this prediction. But later on, I end up making a few Pro Dota models that outperform Valve's predictions, including one that does utilize late game hero success based on their net worth benchmarks. I'm going to go over that in a future video, but for now, it will just be a lot simpler for me to cut out all of the theorizing and then proving, and instead just show you this one output instead. So I've cut that entire section to save you about 10 minutes, and this is what I'm going to replace it with. When I started investigating this problem, I didn't actually have this information, but I do have it now, and I want to show you while it's relevant to the point that I'm making. Here is the projected winner of this specific Team Yandex vs LGD Gaming Game 3, based on 3 different models. The blue model is my best and most accurate Pro Dota model that I made over the course of this investigation. So the yellow model is a slightly less effective model overall, but it does factor in hero information, especially the hero's overall win rate and how well they do in long or super long games. And then the gray model is what Valve actually predicts. So notice how our hero-aware model, that line in yellow, it understands the late game strength of the opponent team, and it does cap out win probability for Radiant very early. It simply stops improving their odds from around 10 to 12 minutes. This is how we would expect a model to behave if it were discounting based on the late game potential of an opponent team. Valve's model is behaving very erratically through the same period of the game. Again, look at our yellow line, because that model already capped Radiant's advantage based on the draft. It doesn't then rapidly punish them just for stalling out. That stall out was already considered in yellow's pricing. While I'm interjecting from the editing room, I realized I never scripted in a plug for my Patreon because it's new and I'm not used to asking for your money. These videos are a ton of work, and you can make it possible for me to continue them for less than 50 cents a week. Plus, your membership comes with some perks for you. Thanks for considering. Alright, let's throw it back to the actual script. So in addition to the fact that this prediction doesn't really seem internally consistent, we can go easily find counterexamples showing Valve's model failing to reproduce this apparent wisdom from similar games. Here's a game where LGD ran a similar strategy against Team Liquid, who also drafted weak, late, and very late game. Both teams are in a dead heat on all metrics. A model that understands late game risk would be giving the late game team a much higher win expectancy at the same 8 to 12 minute mark. But here Valve basically seems to be setting its predictions based on net worth alone. Even in the very next game of the Blast Finals series, LGD once again have a farming Naga Siren on Dire, and Yandex have a Shadow Fiend on Radiant with a push-heavy AoE controlling support cast. But this time, the lead at 12 minutes is 18% lower, but Valve's prediction rate is 4% better for Radiant. So we know for sure that this just is not primarily the interaction between Naga Siren and Shadow Fiend, or late game heroes and early game heroes. There is something else going on here. Now, we haven't really disproven either of those theories, but we have shown that neither of them is the complete explanation. Maybe we can reverse engineer what is happening here with enough samples. We could try using pub matches to test the model tens of thousands of times, and that would help us figure out what is happening, assuming the pub model gives us the same predictions as the pro model. Part of the process of me building a model that was better than Valve's at predicting pub games was testing Valve's model, and what I found is that Valve is much worse at predicting pro Dota games than they are predicting pub Dota games. At the time, I assumed that this meant Valve was just using their normal pub Dota prediction model on pro games, and that was what was causing it to fail more often. That's frankly the only explanation I could think of for Valve having such a good model in pubs and such a mediocre model in pros. But now my research would get a lot easier if this happened to be true, and if you want to generalize from one group to another, first you must try to prove that you cannot. This is a core tenet of science in general and data science in particular. You try to disprove the things that make your life easier. This reduces the impact of something called confirmation bias, where we want something to be true, so we find ways to make it seem true. If we don't actively fight confirmation bias, our whole perspective on the world becomes based on untested beliefs, and inevitably, we will confidently make wildly incorrect decisions. If you don't do this, half your navy dies of scurvy because you think it's totally reasonable to substitute limes for lemons. And I don't want a million metaphorical dead seamen on my hands. So how do we prove whether the model is treating pubs and pros the same? First, let's just verify if the games are predicted differently at different skill levels. That could matter because pro games have extremely high skill players, and it might just be a different rank of pub as far as the model is concerned. We can split games up by most players, and then immortal players, the highest ranked players in pubs, and then separately pro games. Next, let's bucket those predictions by time in the game and the approximate lead in the game as far as net worth is concerned. If we compare Valve's expected win probability between immortal games from other pubs, it is basically the same. There's a little bit of difference here and there on the edges, but that's just because there's a small sample size for immortal. There is really no significant difference between these groups. So this tells us that Valve is probably treating immortal games and games in other skill brackets exactly the same. But Valve's estimates are completely different for pro games. Like, this would not happen unless Valve is treating pro games completely differently. And that means that I, like Quinn before me, was wrong. I saw a reasonable explanation to justify Valve's poor predictions, and I projected it onto the model. Well, this revelation means I also need to validate another assumption that I've been making. When I made my last video, I thought all games were treated basically the same by Valve's model. But technically, there are different tiers of pro games. So of course there are pubs, but then there are things like show matches and amateur leagues, and above that there are elite teams of professional players at the highest level. Most of the time when I say pro game, what I mean is an elite pro game as defined by Dat Dota. But for a lot of my statistical tests, sometimes what I use is any replay that Open Dota has flagged as a ticketed match. And that's just because it makes it much easier for me to go and get a good sample size. A viewer noticed this in my last video and rightfully flagged it as a potential problem. For example, the 500 game sample that I've been using includes a few show matches between streamers rather than games between professional esports teams. And that means it's time for another adventure in statistics, because we need to know if these groups are different. But that turns out to be a bit more complex than it usually would be. We're actually using about 30 predictions from each game, because we're measuring prediction power across the entire course of the game. And that means that each game is contributing multiple data points. What happens later in the game was influenced by everything that came before it. This means that our observations are not all independent of each other. A lot of the standard tests we might use to see how populations compare to each other, such as a t-test or an equivalence test, they require all data points to be independent. It's basically the difference between running the Boston Marathon in gym shorts or running it from inside a Bugatti. Obviously, a marathon only works as a test of endurance if you take the test within the expected parameters. So instead of that, we'll use something called clustered bootstrapping, and that doesn't require independence of observations. It'll tell us if there's a significant difference in how Valve's model approaches scoring these two groups of games. Note that this is not testing whether the games themselves are different. Obviously, amateur league games are going to be different than the international. There's really two questions we want to answer. First, it's possible that Valve's Pro model is fine-tuned on elite pro games, and so by including amateur competition, we're unfairly ruining their results. Maybe their model is better than our measurements imply. Second, it's possible that Valve's model is handling each of these groups differently, just like it's using different methods for pro games and pub games. In this case, our tests didn't show any meaningful difference between these groups. Now, we'll settle for failing to prove that they're different. In the future, when I have ready access to a larger sample of replays from each group, we could come back and prove that any difference is negligible. Those two proofs are not quite the same thing, but for our purposes, they are functionally the same. This is also a fairly strong argument that whatever is messing up Valve's predictions is probably triggered by the process of adding a game to an event, or maybe it's triggered by Captain's Draft or a custom lobby bug. The too long didn't read is that yes, we can use all ticketed games when measuring Valve's model. We haven't done anything unfair. Valve's model posts similar results for all ticketed matches, and there's no statistical difference in the results between different tiers of pro play. Just how good or bad Valve's Pro prediction model is in the eye of the beholder. But what I do know is that my earlier model, which didn't even know pro games exist, is predicting better on average than their model by a fairly decent margin. Based on the situation Quinn identified in Yandex vs LGD Game 3, it does look like this prediction model is not responding to net worth the way that it should. This isn't always the case, but I did a very quick review of very high net worth leads and saw some troubling trends. And you have to remember that net worth lead is the single best predictor in Dota 2. So if we really want to know what's going wrong with these pro predictions, we should look at how net worth is being utilized in them. To do this, we're going to do something called slicing. And here's some fake data to show how it works. It's not as complicated as it seems, but it does break your brain a little the first time you think about it. So first, let's make a graph of all games. Left to right, we have what Valve predicts as Radiant's chance to win. So all the way on the left means Dire will definitely win. All the way on the right means Radiant will definitely win. Then top to bottom, we have the actual outcome. The top is Radiant does win, the bottom is Radiant loses. Then we can line up all of the winning games on the top based on what Valve said its chance of winning was along the x-axis. And we do the same thing for losses along the bottom. And we end up with an array of games sort of like this. Then we can split up games into groups and average their positions. This tells us how the typical prediction for this group compares to the typical outcome for this group. Repeat for each of the groups, and now we can see how reliable each prediction is. If the line falls along the dotted diagonal, that means the predictions perfectly represent reality, at least on average. Basically, things that should happen 10% of the time do happen 10% of the time. But what if we group games by their net worth instead of by their predicted win rate? Well, the averages would probably look a lot different, and that would give us a visual of how far off predictions are when we arrange them by net worth. And here's the real data of that process. Overall, Valve's predictions in pro games are chronically underconfident based on the net worth lead. What this means is that the leading team in pro games are, on average, quite a lot more likely to win than Valve expects. Which is strange because overall, Valve is too confident once it decides a team is moderately favored, which you can see with this line. The bulge over the lower line and below the upper line indicate that whatever is causing Valve to change its predictions is not a good replacement for net worth. Another way to say this is Valve is compressing the win probability toward 50-50 whenever there's a net worth lead. You can see this very clearly in the confidence distribution chart. It shows us the percentage of total predictions Valve is making at each level of confidence. The more confident a model is, the more predictions will trend to the sides and away from the middle of this chart. But Valve's pro predictions, when grouped by net worth, are extremely weighted along the 50-50 line. And what's more, it skews very noticeably toward the dire team. That implies that Radiant is getting less credit for a net worth lead than Dire is. Compare against normal slicing and you'll see a very different shape here. All the areas where these shapes do not overlap represent predictions that use something other than net worth as their predominant input. So the data at this point honestly is starting to look like somebody with investment in Dire side property paid off the judges. Now, I should flag that my pro sample does have an unusually high amount of Dire wins in it. They did win more than 50% of the games in the sample, but in combination with Valve's poor accuracy and poor ranking ability, that really doesn't explain the whole situation. And before making this video, I did already determine what are the factors that are contributing to Valve's miscalibration. But this video is already getting a little bit long, so I'm going to have to split this into multiple parts. Consider this video the proof case showing that Valve's model is seriously messed up. It has an unexplained Dire favoring bias, it is pretending games are closer than they are, it does not understand drafts, and its accuracy and error rates are suffering because of these factors. Overall, the predictions are still fine, but I promise that you do not know why it is making the predictions that it makes. It does not matter how good you are at understanding Dota. Arguably, the better you are at understanding Dota, the less likely you are to understand Valve's predictions. This whole thing really shows you how Quinn is just on another level. He was able to identify exactly what was happening in this game. He knew exactly the win expectancy that should have been seen, and he noticed the gap in real time. Then he was able to expertly reverse engineer plausible explanations about the draft matchup, again, all in real time without looking things up. And those explanations mostly withstood deep interrogation using real data long after the fact. The only problem is that Valve's model didn't know any of it. It just so happens that the way that Valve's model was wrong worked out for such a strange and unusual game. The pro win expectancies that Valve shows really are more like high concept modern art. You can justify it, you can project meaning onto it, but in the end, it's just a meaningless shape without clear rationale. So next video, here's what we'll do. We're going to walk through and measure what is going wrong to better understand why Valve's model is behaving in the strange way it does. Then, I'm going to show you how I've learned to predict Pro Dota better than Valve does. Alright, let's thank the people who make these videos possible. Henry Elkington, Von Jojo, thank you for your generous Fam of the Cow support. And Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, St. Catfish, Svenge, and Mikhail B, thank you for your Friend of the Cow tier support. And thank you to all my other supporters whose names you see scrolling across your screen. You too can help make sure these videos keep coming. You can tip me here on YouTube, you can subscribe on YouTube, you can get a membership here or over on Patreon. There's lots of ways to help this channel out. If you just want to link up with me and other Dota, data, and gaming nerds, you can find a link to a Discord in my profile. finally, thanks to you for watching all the way to the end and probably being a super chill person, and just, I'll see you in the next video.